The glass rang out sharp and clear as Daniel Ashford tapped his knife against his champagne flute, and the entire ballroom fell silent within seconds, forks pausing mid-air, conversations dying mid-sentence, every eye turning toward the head table where he stood, tall and polished, his tuxedo perfectly tailored, his smile wide and practiced. Claire Whitfield sat 2 seats away from him, her hands folded quietly in her lap, and something in her chest tightened the moment she saw the look on his face, a look she had learned to recognize over the past 6 years of marriage, a look that meant he was about to perform. The occasion was the 10th anniversary gala for Ashford Logistics, the company Daniel had built from a single delivery van into a firm with 300 employees and contracts across 4 states. 200 guests filled the ballroom of the Grandview Hotel that night, investors in dark suits, employees in rented tuxedos, old friends from college, and Daniel's mother Margaret seated at the front, her chin lifted with pride. Claire had spent the last 4 months helping plan this exact evening, choosing the flowers, negotiating with the caterers, writing the speech Daniel now held folded in his jacket pocket. None of that mattered to the room. To the room, she was simply the wife, the quiet woman in the pale blue dress who smiled politely and said very little. Daniel cleared his throat and began to speak about the journey of the company, about the sacrifices and the sleepless nights, about the employees who had believed in his vision when no one else did. The crowd listened, some nodding, some already reaching for their wine glasses in anticipation of the toast. Claire listened too, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel proud, because she had watched him build this from nothing, had watched him drive that first van himself at 2 in the morning to make a delivery when he could not afford another driver. She had believed in him before anyone else had. But then Daniel's eyes moved toward her, and his tone shifted just slightly, the warmth in his voice replaced by something sharper, something performative. He began to talk about balance, about how a man needs support at home in order to succeed in the world, and the room chuckled knowingly, expecting a sweet tribute. Claire felt her shoulders relax slightly, thinking perhaps this was the moment he would thank her properly, the moment she had quietly hoped for through 4 months of unpaid labor behind the scenes. Instead, Daniel smiled at the crowd and said that some partners simply were not built for the spotlight, that some people were better suited to stay in the background where they were most comfortable. A few people laughed, unsure if it was a joke. He continued, saying that not everyone could handle pressure or numbers or big decisions, and that he had learned early on it was better not to lean on Claire for anything requiring real judgment. The laughter grew louder now, more confident, because the room had decided this was meant to be funny. Claire kept her face still. She had spent years training herself not to react in public, not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. But something about tonight felt different, more deliberate, as if Daniel had planned this specific moment in front of these specific people, the investors he wanted to impress with his authority, the board members who had once questioned whether he was serious enough to lead a growing company. He was not finished. Daniel raised his glass toward her, and in a tone dripping with false affection, he said that Claire was lucky to have him, because without him she would still be filing paperwork somewhere forgettable, doing work that meant nothing, going nowhere. The room erupted into full laughter now, some uncomfortable, some genuine, and Claire felt heat rise up her neck, not from embarrassment alone but from a slow, burning realization that had been building for years, a realization she had pushed away again and again, because leaving felt harder than staying. She looked down at her plate, at the untouched salmon and the wilting garnish beside it, and for one long moment she considered simply standing up and walking out of the ballroom without a word. But something held her in place, some instinct telling her that leaving now would only prove his point, would only let him control the narrative of the evening even in her absence. Margaret, Daniel's mother, was not laughing. Claire noticed this immediately, the older woman's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flicking between her son and her daughter-in-law with something that looked almost like worry. Beside Margaret sat Grace Bennett, Claire's closest friend since university, and Grace's jaw had gone tight, her fingers gripping the stem of her wine glass so hard her knuckles had turned pale. Daniel, emboldened by the laughter, continued speaking, his voice carrying easily across the microphone system that had been installed for exactly this kind of moment. A moment he had clearly imagined would cement his image as a confident, commanding man in front of everyone who mattered to his career. He made another comment, something about how he sometimes wondered what his life would look like with someone more his equal, someone who could actually keep pace with him intellectually. And this time the laughter faltered slightly, several guests glancing toward Claire with expressions caught somewhere between pity and discomfort. Peter Lansing, one of the company's senior directors, shifted uncomfortably in his seat near the front, his eyes meeting his wife's across the table, both of them clearly unsure whether to laugh along or stay silent. Henry Caldwell, an early investor in the company who had known Claire for years, set down his fork entirely, his expression hardening into something unreadable. Claire felt every second stretch longer than it should, the room's attention pressing against her like physical weight. She thought of all the nights she had stayed awake helping Daniel prepare investor presentations, the weekends she had spent teaching herself accounting software just to help him catch errors in his financial reports, the birthday she had missed because he needed her to handle a supplier crisis while he was traveling. None of that existed in the story he was telling tonight. In his story, she was simply lucky to be near him. The band, waiting for their cue, stood frozen near the stage, unsure whether to begin playing or wait for the toast to conclude. Waitstaff paused near the kitchen doors, trays balanced carefully, sensing the strange tension that had settled over what should have been a joyful room. Somewhere near the back, a young employee filmed part of the speech on her phone, not realizing yet what she was capturing, thinking only that it might be a nice memory to share with coworkers later. Daniel lifted his glass higher, preparing for what he clearly intended to be his closing line, the moment that would draw applause and cement the story of the evening as one of his triumph, his generosity, his greatness in choosing to keep a woman like Claire by his side, despite what he implied were her obvious limitations. He opened his mouth to speak again, and the entire ballroom leaned in slightly, waiting, none of them knowing that the quiet woman in the pale blue dress was about to change everything about how this night would be remembered. In the seconds before she moved, Claire's mind raced back through the years that had led her to this exact chair, in this exact ballroom, listening to this exact man reduce her to a punchline in front of everyone whose respect he had spent a decade chasing. She remembered the small apartment they had shared when the company was only an idea sketched on napkins, when Daniel used to come home smelling of diesel fuel and exhaustion, and she would rub the ache out of his shoulders while reviewing spreadsheets neither of them fully understood yet. She remembered convincing her own father to lend them money nobody else believed they could repay, money that became the deposit on their first delivery van. None of the guests in this room knew that story. To them, she had simply appeared one day as Daniel's quiet wife, arriving late to a success she had helped create from its very first hour. She thought too of the smaller moments, the ones that never made it into any speech, like the time Daniel forgot his own mother's birthday, and Claire had quietly arranged the entire dinner under his name, so Margaret would never know, or the time a supplier tried to cancel a contract days before a major shipment, and Claire had spent 6 hours on the phone repairing the relationship, while Daniel took credit for saving the account in front of the board the following week. She had never minded staying invisible before, not really. Because she told herself it did not matter who received the applause as long as the family stayed steady and the company stayed alive. But standing here now, listening to laughter aimed directly at her, she understood with sudden clarity that invisibility and humiliation were not the same thing, and she had confused the two for far too long. Around the room, the reactions had begun to shift even before Claire spoke a single word. Grace leaned toward Margaret and murmured something too quiet for anyone else to hear, and Margaret's frown deepened, her eyes fixed on her son with an expression that looked less like pride and more like disappointment. Near the far end of the table, a young woman from the marketing department lowered her phone slightly, sensing that whatever she was filming had just turned into something far more significant than a nostalgic clip for the company newsletter. Peter Lansing exchanged a brief, uneasy glance with his wife, both of them suddenly aware that the ground beneath the evening had shifted in a way neither could yet name. Daniel, still holding his glass aloft, faltered for just a moment as he registered that Claire had risen without his permission, without any cue from him, and something flickered across his face, a flash of confusion quickly masked by his usual easy smile. He had expected her to sit quietly through his remarks as she always had, to absorb the joke and smile, along with everyone else, so the evening could continue exactly as he had scripted it in his mind. Her standing was not part of his plan, and for the briefest instant, uncertainty crept into eyes that had, moments earlier, radiated nothing but confidence. The microphone stand sat only a few feet from where Claire stood, close enough that she did not need to ask permission or search for another way to be heard. She took one measured step toward it, then another, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor of the ballroom, each footstep landing in a silence so complete that even the clinking of ice in distant glasses seemed to pause. She reached the microphone and paused there for a moment, not out of hesitation but out of quiet deliberation, the kind of pause that comes from someone who has finally decided, after years of staying silent, exactly what she intends to say and precisely how she intends to say it. Daniel had not expected this. He stood frozen near the head table, his champagne glass still raised halfway, the smile on his face beginning to crack at the edges as he watched his wife walk toward the microphone he had installed for his own moment of glory. He glanced quickly at Henry Caldwell, then at the row of investors seated near the front, searching their faces for some reassurance that this was still, somehow, part of the evening's charm. He found none. Henry's expression had gone flat and unreadable, his arms crossed over his chest in a way that suggested he was reevaluating something far more important than the seating arrangement. Before Claire reached the microphone, however, the room did not simply wait in silence. A ripple of whispers spread from table to table, guests leaning toward one another to ask what was happening, some assuming this must be a planned surprise, a wife stepping up to offer a loving rebuttal to her husband's playful teasing. Others, more perceptive, understood immediately that something had shifted, that the air in the room had changed from celebratory to charged, the way a summer sky changes color moments before a storm breaks. Daniel, sensing he was losing control of a moment he had carefully orchestrated, tried to recover. He laughed again, louder this time, and said into his own microphone that Claire probably just wanted to say a few words of thanks, that she got shy in front of crowds but he was sure she would manage. The comment was meant to diminish her before she even spoke, to frame whatever she said next as small and forgettable, a footnote beneath his own grand narrative. A few guests chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh along or hold their breath. Claire reached the microphone stand and adjusted it slightly, lowering it to meet her height, the small mechanical click of the adjustment somehow audible across the entire ballroom in the thick silence that had settled over the crowd. She looked out at the sea of faces, at the investors in their expensive suits, at the employees who had spent years building this company alongside Daniel, at Margaret sitting rigid in her chair, at Grace whose eyes were bright with something between worry and fierce loyalty. She did not look afraid. She looked, for the first time in years, entirely certain of herself. Before she spoke, memories continued to surface, unbidden and vivid, memories of every dinner party where Daniel had introduced her as simply his wife without mentioning her name, every business trip where he had asked her to stay behind because clients preferred to negotiate without distractions, every argument that ended with him telling her she was overreacting, that she should be grateful for the life he had built for her. She thought of the years she had spent shrinking herself smaller and smaller, convincing herself that keeping the peace mattered more than being seen, that love sometimes required silence as its price. She thought, too, of a conversation with her father years earlier before he passed, when he had told her that the loudest person in a room is rarely the strongest one, that true strength often speaks so quietly the whole world has to lean in just to hear it. She had carried that advice with her through every humiliation she had swallowed since, telling herself that her turn to speak would come eventually, that patience was not the same as weakness. Standing at that microphone now, she understood that her father had been preparing her for exactly this moment without either of them knowing it at the time. Daniel shifted uncomfortably at the head table, glancing toward the exit as though calculating how quickly this could be steered back under his control. He caught Margaret's eye and saw nothing but disapproval reflected back at him, a look he had not seen from his mother since he was a teenager caught in a lie. He turned instead toward Peter Lansing, hopping for some subtle signal of support, but Peter simply looked down at the tablecloth, unwilling to meet his employer's gaze. The young marketing employee near the back of the room had fully raised her phone again by now, recording without hesitation, sensing that whatever happened in the next several minutes would matter far more than any polished highlight reel the company had planned for its social media accounts. Around her, several other guests quietly did the same, their phones angled discreetly toward the stage, capturing a moment none of them yet understood the full weight of. Claire drew a slow breath, and in that breath the entire history of her marriage seemed to compress into something small and clear, something she could finally hold in her open hand and examine without flinching. She thought of the nights she had cried quietly in the bathroom so Daniel would not hear, telling herself it was simply stress from the business, not truly a reflection of how he treated her. She thought of the friends who had slowly stopped inviting her to things because Daniel always found a reason to make her feel small when they were together, and how she had let those friendships fade rather than confront what was happening at home. She thought of the years she had spent believing that the story of her worth belonged entirely to him to write. Daniel, growing visibly anxious now, attempted one final interruption. He said, with a laugh that had lost most of its confidence, that perhaps they should let the band start playing and continue the toasts a little later, that there was plenty of time for speeches throughout the evening. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, a small betrayal of the composure he had spent the entire event trying to project. No one moved to comply with his suggestion. The room remained fixed on Claire, waiting. Margaret rose slightly from her seat, as though preparing to intervene on her son's behalf out of old habit, but Grace placed a gentle hand on her arm, a silent request to wait, to let this unfold exactly as it needed to. Margaret settled back into her chair, her eyes never leaving Claire's face, and for the first time that evening, something like respect began to replace the disappointment that had clouded her expression only minutes earlier. Claire finally leaned toward the microphone, close enough that her voice, when it came, would carry to every corner of the ballroom without effort, without needing to be raised, without any trace of anger or desperation. The crowd leaned forward as one, waiting. The silence in the room now so complete that the soft hum of the air conditioning system became audible for the first time all evening. Somewhere near the kitchen, a single tray clattered softly against a counter, and even that small sound seemed enormous in the stillness. Daniel's jaw tightened as he watched his wife stand there, poised and unshaken, and for the first time since the toast began, real uncertainty crossed his face, the dawning realization that whatever happened in the next few seconds was no longer within his control, that the story of this evening, the story he had spent months planning to tell about himself, was about to be rewritten by someone he had never truly believed capable of taking the pen from his hand. The investors near the front exchanged quick, uneasy glances, their earlier polite amusement replaced entirely by sharp, focused attention, the kind reserved for moments that might genuinely matter, moments that could shift the way they viewed a business partner they had trusted with significant sums of money. Henry Caldwell, in particular, watched Claire with an intensity that suggested he already sensed this evening would change something fundamental about his continued involvement with Ashford Logistics. Claire's eyes moved briefly to Daniel, and in that look there was no anger, no plea for reconciliation, no flicker of the old deference that had defined so much of their marriage. There was only a calm, unwavering steadiness, the look of a woman who had finally stopped waiting for someone else's permission to speak her own truth. Before she began, her gaze drifted briefly across the room, settling for a moment on a table near the side wall where several younger employees sat. Women who had joined Ashford Logistics in the past 2 years, women who often worked long hours without recognition, women whose names Daniel rarely bothered to learn correctly even after months of employment. Claire had spoken with several of them quietly over the past year, at company picnics and holiday parties, listening to small stories of being overlooked in meetings, of having their ideas credited to male colleagues, of being told gently but firmly that certain decisions were better left to people with more experience, a phrase that always seemed to apply to men significantly younger than the women it was used against. She had filed those stories away without knowing exactly why, only sensing that they mattered, that they were part of a larger pattern she herself was living inside without fully nomming it. She thought of her own career, the one she had set aside almost entirely in the early years of the marriage, the promising position in supply chain management she had left behind because Daniel needed help getting the company off the ground, and there had not seemed to be room for 2 demanding careers under one roof. She had told herself at the time that the sacrifice was temporary, that once the business stabilized, she would return to her own ambitions, but temporary had quietly stretched into 6 years, and somewhere along the way, Daniel had stopped even acknowledging that she once had ambitions of her own to return to. The silence in the ballroom stretched further, thick enough that several guests began exchanging uncertain glances, unsure whether they were witnessing something rehearsed or something entirely unplanned and real. A waiter near the kitchen door stood frozen mid-step, a tray of dessert plates balanced carefully in his hands, his eyes fixed on the small woman in the pale blue dress, standing at the microphone with a composure that seemed almost otherworldly given what had just been said to her in front of 200 people. Daniel attempted to fill the silence once more, his voice noticeably thinner now, the confident boom that had carried through his earlier remarks replaced by something closer to nervous energy. He said her name, gently, almost pleading, as though trying to remind her of some unspoken agreement between them, some understanding that certain things were simply not said in public no matter how true they might be behind closed doors. Claire did not turn to look at him. She kept her eyes on the crowd, on the faces waiting for her response, and something in her stillness made it clear that whatever agreement Daniel believed existed between them had just been permanently dissolved. Margaret watched her daughter-in-law with an expression that had shifted entirely now from concern to something closer to quiet admiration, the same look she remembered giving her own mother decades earlier during a similarly difficult family dinner, a look she had almost forgotten she was capable of giving anyone. She thought suddenly of conversations she had tried to have with Daniel over the years about the way he spoke to Claire, conversations he had always brushed aside with the same easy charm he used on everyone, assuring his mother that Claire understood he was only joking, that she knew he loved her beneath the surface teasing. Margaret had wanted to believe him, had needed to believe her son was not the kind of man who diminished the people closest to him, but sitting in that ballroom now, watching Claire's steady posture and unwavering eyes, she understood with sudden painful clarity that she had been wrong to accept his explanations for so long. Grace, seated beside Margaret, felt her own throat tighten with something between pride and old grief, remembering countless phone calls over the years where Claire had downplayed small cruelties, had explained away comments that should never have needed explaining, had insisted that Daniel simply had a difficult sense of humor that outsiders sometimes misunderstood. Grace had never fully believed those explanations, had always sensed a deeper unhappiness beneath her friend's careful composure. But she had respected Claire's right to handle her own marriage in her own time, trusting that eventually her friend would find the strength to stand exactly where she now stood. The band, still waiting near the stage for some signal to begin playing, exchanged quiet, questioning looks among themselves, the drummer setting down his sticks entirely, sensing that whatever unfolded next deserved the room's full and undivided attention rather than any musical accompaniment. Even the hotel staff stationed discreetly along the walls seemed to understand instinctively that this was not a moment to be rushed or interrupted, and they stood motionless, watching along with everyone else. Claire allowed the silence to stretch just a moment longer, not out of theatrical timing, but because she wanted to be entirely certain of her own voice before she used it, wanted the words that came next to carry the full weight of everything she had swallowed for years without a single tremor of doubt undermining them. She thought briefly of her father again, of his quiet insistence that dignity was never loud, that the people who truly needed to shout the loudest were usually the ones most afraid of being ignored. She understood now, standing in front of everyone who had just laughed at Daniel's cruel joke at her expense, exactly what her father had meant, and she understood that she was about to prove it in front of every single person who mattered to her husband's carefully constructed image of himself. Claire spoke, and her voice, when it finally came, was steady and unhurried, carrying easily to the farthest corners of the ballroom without needing to rise above a normal, conversational tone. She thanked everyone for coming, her words gracious and unhurried, and for a moment several guests relaxed slightly, assuming she was simply about to offer the sweet, forgettable remarks Daniel had predicted only minutes earlier. Then she paused, and her next words landed with a weight that silenced even the faint background hum of the room's air conditioning. She said that she had heard, many times over the years, that she was not built for the spotlight, that she preferred to stay quietly in the background. She said this was true, and she said it without shame, explaining that she had never needed a stage or a microphone to know the value of her own work, because she had spent the last 6 years building something alongside her husband that neither of them could have built alone. She reminded the room, gently but clearly, that the company they were celebrating that night had begun with a loan her own father provided, when no bank would take a chance on an unproven young man with nothing but ambition and a used delivery van. She said she had spent countless nights reviewing contracts long after Daniel had gone to sleep, had personally salvaged 3 major accounts that would have collapsed without her intervention, had sat beside her husband through every difficult negotiation of the company's early years. Offering counsel, he had accepted gratefully in private, even as he now claimed publicly that she lacked the judgment for such things. A murmur rippled through the crowd, quiet but unmistakable, guests turning toward one another with raised eyebrows, some nodding slowly as pieces of a story they had never fully understood began settling into place. Henry Caldwell leaned forward in his seat, his earlier discomfort replaced now by focused, careful attention, the expression of a man recalculating exactly how much he actually knew about the business he had invested significant capital into over the years. Claire continued, her tone never rising, never sharpening into anger, remaining instead calm and measured in a way that somehow made her words land with far greater force than shouting ever could have. She said that she understood now why Daniel needed tonight's audience to believe she was fortunate to be near him, because a man who truly believed in his own accomplishments would never need to diminish the person standing beside him in order to feel tall. She said that real confidence did not require an audience of 200 people to confirm it, and that a man secure in his own worth would never need to borrow height by making someone else appear smaller. The room had gone entirely still now, every guest fixed on Claire's composed figure at the microphone, the earlier laughter that had filled the space only minutes before replaced by something closer to reverent silence. A few guests glanced toward Daniel, watching his face closely, watching the confident mask he had worn all evening begin visibly cracking under the weight of his wife's calm, unhurried words. Claire turned slightly, her gaze finally settling directly on her husband for the first time since she had risen from her chair. She told him, gently but without any softness that might dilute the truth of what she was saying, that she forgave him for tonight, because she understood now that people who need to humiliate others in public are usually the ones most afraid of their own emptiness, most desperate to convince a room full of strangers of something they cannot convince themselves of in private. She said she hoped he would find whatever peace he was searching for, because whatever it was, it clearly was not something he had found yet, not in 6 years of marriage, not in building a company from nothing, not even standing here tonight surrounded by everyone he had worked so hard to impress. Daniel's face had gone pale, his earlier bravado entirely drained away, replaced by something raw and exposed that he had likely never intended anyone in that room to witness. He opened his mouth as though to respond, but no words came, his usual easy charm apparently unable to summon any defense against the quiet devastation of his wife's composed, unhurried honesty. Claire was not finished. She said that she had spent years believing love required her to shrink herself smaller and smaller until she nearly disappeared entirely, that she had mistaken her own silence for strength, when really it had only been fear dressed up as patience. She said she was done making that mistake. She thanked the room again for celebrating 10 years of hard work, work she was proud to have been part of even if her name rarely appeared beside it, and she said she hoped everyone would enjoy the rest of the evening, because she certainly intended to. With that, Claire stepped back from the microphone, smoothed the front of her dress once more with the same steady hand she had used earlier, and walked calmly back toward her seat, her heels once again clicking softly against the polished floor in a silence so complete that every footstep echoed clearly across the enormous room. She did not rush. She did not look back at Daniel. She simply returned to her chair, sat down with quiet dignity, and reached for her water glass as though nothing extraordinary had just occurred. For several seconds, absolutely no one in the ballroom moved or spoke, the silence stretching so long it became almost unbearable, until finally, from somewhere near the back of the room, a single person began to clap. It was one of the young women from the marketing table, the same woman who had been quietly recording the entire exchange on her phone, and her applause, tentative at first, grew steadily as others around her joined in, hesitant but genuine, until the sound spread across the room like a wave gathering strength, table by table, until nearly the entire ballroom was applauding, not for Daniel's speech about a decade of business success, but for the woman who had just, with perfect composure and devastating honesty, told the truth in front of everyone who needed to hear it. Margaret was among the first to rise to her feet, clapping steadily, tears gathering unashamedly in the corners of her eyes as she looked at her daughter-in-law with an expression of pure, unguarded pride. Grace stood immediately beside her, applauding fiercely, a wide smile breaking across her face despite the tears also threatening to fall. Henry Caldwell rose as well, his applause measured but genuine, his eyes fixed thoughtfully on Daniel, already turning over calculations about future meetings, future contracts, future conversations about leadership and character that would need to happen soon. Peter Lansing clapped too, though more quietly, glancing occasionally toward his employer with an expression that suggested he was already reconsidering several assumptions he had long held about the man who signed his paychecks. Even some of the investors near the front, men who rarely allowed themselves visible reactions during business events, nodded slowly to one another, murmuring quiet observations that would likely find their way into private conversations over the following days. Daniel remained standing near the head table throughout the applause, his champagne glass now lowered entirely, his face a mixture of shock, humiliation, and something that looked almost like the beginning of genuine shame. He glanced around the room, searching desperately for some ally, some familiar face willing to rescue him from the moment, the way people had always seemed willing to rescue him before, smoothing over his sharper comments with laughter, excusing his behavior as simply part of his larger-than-life personality. He found no such rescue this time. Every face he turned to reflected back the same quiet, unmistakable shift, the recognition that something fundamental about how they viewed him had just changed permanently. The applause eventually settled, and the band, sensing the moment finally required their intervention, began playing something soft and instrumental, giving the room permission to slowly return to its normal rhythm of conversation and movement, though the atmosphere had unmistakably transformed. Guests leaned toward one another, whispering about what they had just witnessed, several already pulling out their phones to check whether the moment had been captured, which of course it had, in multiple angles by multiple people, footage that would soon travel far beyond the walls of the Grandview Hotel ballroom. Claire sat quietly at her seat, sipping her water, her expression calm and unreadable to anyone who did not know her closely, though Grace, watching from across the table, could see the faint tremor in her friend's hand as she set the glass back down, the only outward sign of the enormous effort it had taken to remain so composed through everything that had just happened. Grace reached across the table and squeezed Claire's hand briefly, saying nothing, because nothing needed to be said between them in that moment. Daniel finally lowered himself back into his chair, the earlier confident posture gone entirely, replaced by something stooped and uncertain that looked entirely unfamiliar on a man who had spent a decade cultivating an image of effortless command. He glanced toward Claire several times over the following minutes, clearly hopping to catch her eye, to find some opening for private conversation, some path back toward the version of the evening he had originally planned. Claire did not look at him. She turned instead toward Grace, engaging in quiet conversation about nothing consequential at all, her composure never once wavering, and in her deliberate refusal to acknowledge him, Daniel understood perhaps for the first time exactly how completely the balance of power between them had shifted in the space of only a few short minutes. The rest of the gala continued around them, guests slowly returning to their meals, the band continuing its soft instrumental set, waiters resuming their careful navigation between tables, yet the underlying current of the evening had been permanently altered. Small clusters of conversation formed throughout the room, guests discussing quietly what they had witnessed. Some expressing open admiration for Claire's composure, others speculating cautiously about what it might mean for the company's leadership going forward, a few simply sitting in thoughtful silence, replaying the moment in their minds. Margaret eventually made her way over to Claire's side of the table, kneeling slightly beside her daughter-in-law's chair, taking her hand gently and telling her, quietly enough that only Claire and Grace could hear, that she was proud of her, that she should have spoken up herself years earlier when she first noticed how her son sometimes treated the woman who had given up so much for their family. Claire thanked her softly, her composure finally beginning to soften just slightly at the corners, though she still did not allow herself to cry. Not yet, not in front of 200 people who had already seen more of her private pain than she had ever intended to share. As the evening wore on, it became increasingly clear that whatever Daniel had hoped to accomplish with his carefully planned toast had been entirely undone, replaced by a moment that would be discussed, replayed, and remembered far longer than any speech about company milestones ever could have been. A moment that had revealed, in the space of only a few unhurried minutes, exactly who each of them truly was beneath the polished surfaces they presented to the world. Near midnight, as the gala began winding down and guests started gathering coats and exchanging polite farewells, Claire found herself standing near the coat check with Grace, watching Daniel across the emptying ballroom as he attempted, with visibly diminished energy, to continue networking with the remaining investors. She noticed how differently people responded to him now, their handshakes shorter, their conversations briefer, their eyes less willing to linger on his face the way they had earlier in the evening, when his confidence had still seemed like something worth admiring rather than something to view with new suspicion. Grace asked quietly whether Claire was all right, and Claire considered the question honestly before answering, surprised to discover that beneath the exhaustion of the evening, she felt something unfamiliar and startling, a kind of lightness she had not experienced in years, as though a weight she had carried for so long it had become part of her posture had suddenly, finally, been set down. She told Grace that she felt more like herself in that moment than she had in a very long time, and Grace squeezed her arm gently, telling her that everyone in that room had seen exactly who Claire truly was, perhaps for the first time, and that the sight had clearly moved every person who witnessed it. Across the room, Henry Caldwell approached Daniel with an expression far more serious than his usual easy business smile, and though Claire could not hear their conversation from where she stood, she could read enough in Henry's posture and Daniel's increasingly stiff responses to understand that difficult questions were already being raised, questions about leadership, about character, about whether the company's public image could withstand footage that was likely already circulating among younger employees who had captured the moment on their phones. Daniel's shoulders remained tense throughout the exchange, his hands occasionally gesturing in the familiar persuasive manner he used during negotiations, though tonight the gestures seemed to be landing with far less effect than usual. Peter Lansing approached Claire briefly before leaving, offering a quiet, sincere word of respect that surprised her with its warmth, telling her that he had worked alongside Daniel for nearly 8 years and had never once heard anyone speak such necessary truth so calmly and with such little malice. Claire thanked him, genuinely touched, and watched him walk away toward the exit with his wife, already deep in quiet conversation about what they had witnessed. Margaret lingered longest of anyone, eventually pulling Claire into a firm, lengthy embrace near the ballroom entrance, whispering that she was sorry it had taken her this long to say something, that she had noticed the small cruelties over the years, and told herself repeatedly that it was not her place to interfere in her son's marriage, a decision she now recognized as a failure of her own courage rather than genuine respect for boundaries. Claire held onto her mother-in-law a moment longer than usual, grateful for the honesty, and told her softly that it was never too late to see clearly, that she herself had only just learned that lesson tonight. As the last guests trickled out into the cool night air, Claire remained near the entrance for a while, watching the valet attendants bring cars around, watching couples climb into taxis still murmuring quietly about the evening's unexpected turn, watching the young marketing employee walk past with her phone still in hand, glancing briefly at Claire with an expression of quiet, genuine admiration before offering a small, respectful nod and continuing on her way. Daniel eventually approached Claire near the entrance, his posture noticeably diminished from the confident figure who had raised his glass so triumphantly only hours earlier. He attempted to speak, opening his mouth several times as though searching for the right combination of words that might undo what had happened, might restore some version of the evening he had originally envisioned. Claire watched him struggle for a moment, feeling not anger exactly, but a kind of distant, almost clinical curiosity, as though observing a stranger rather than the man she had shared 6 years of her life with. She told him simply that they would talk when they got home, her tone neither cold nor warm, merely factual, and she turned to retrieve her coat from the attendant without waiting for his response. The drive home passed in near total silence, the city lights sliding past the car windows in long, smeared streaks of gold and white, neither of them speaking, both of them aware that whatever conversation waited for them, once they arrived home, would need to address far more than the events of a single evening, that it would need to address years of accumulated silence, finally given voice in front of the very people Daniel had spent his entire career trying to impress. By Monday morning, the footage from the gala had already spread quietly through the company, passed between employees through private messages and quiet conversations near the coffee machines, though no one dared bring it up directly in front of Daniel himself. He arrived at the office later than usual, his usual brisk confidence replaced by something guarded and watchful, and he noticed immediately the subtle change in how people greeted him. The way conversations paused slightly when he entered a room, the way eye contact lingered a beat too long before sliding away. Henry Caldwell requested a private meeting with Daniel that same week, and though Claire was not present for the conversation, she later learned through Margaret, who had heard from a close family friend on the board, that Henry had raised serious concerns about Daniel's judgment and temperament, questioning whether a man who treated his own wife with such public disrespect could truly be trusted with the growing responsibilities of leading a company that other people's livelihoods depended upon. Henry stopped short of withdrawing his investment entirely, but he made it clear that any future funding would come with far greater oversight, far more accountability, and considerably less unquestioned trust than Daniel had grown accustomed to over the years. Peter Lansing, who had always been quietly loyal to Daniel, found himself reconsidering small moments from years past, conversations where Daniel had made similarly dismissive comments about Claire in casual settings, comments Peter had always brushed aside as simply part of Daniel's blunt personality. He began noticing, too, how Daniel spoke to some of the younger women on staff, comments that had always seemed harmless enough in isolation, but now, viewed together, painted a pattern Peter found increasingly difficult to ignore. He did not confront Daniel directly, not yet, but he began documenting instances more carefully, uncertain what he might eventually do with the information, but unwilling to simply forget what he now recognized. At home, the days following the gala unfolded with a tension neither Claire nor Daniel had experienced before in their marriage, not the familiar tension of unspoken resentment simmering beneath polite conversation, but something rawer and more honest, uncomfortable in its clarity. Daniel attempted several times to apologize, though his early attempts carried the same practiced charm he used in business negotiations, phrases that sounded rehearsed rather than genuinely felt. Explanations that subtly shifted blame toward the pressure of running a company, toward the stress of public speaking, toward anything other than his own choices. Claire listened to each attempt without interrupting, and each time she told him calmly that she appreciated the effort but did not yet believe he understood what he was actually apologizing for. Grace checked in on Claire regularly during those weeks, sometimes over coffee, sometimes simply through long phone calls late in the evening, and during one such conversation, Claire admitted something she had not fully allowed herself to articulate even in her own thoughts, that speaking up at the gala had not felt like an ending, but rather like the first genuine beginning she had experienced in years. She told Grace that she had spent so long defining herself entirely in relation to Daniel, as his wife, his quiet support, his background presence, that she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to imagine a version of her life that existed independently of his approval. Margaret, meanwhile, began visiting Claire more frequently, the two women developing a closeness that had never quite existed between them before, built now on a foundation of honesty rather than the careful politeness that typically characterizes relationships between mothers and daughters-in-law. During one visit, Margaret confessed that she had married a man decades earlier who shared certain qualities with her son, a man whose charm masked a deep need to feel superior to everyone around him, including his own wife, and she admitted that she had stayed silent through most of her own marriage, telling herself it was simply the way things were, that raising Daniel had been her primary purpose, and everything else was secondary. She told Claire she did not want to see her repeat that same pattern of silence, and she offered, without being asked, to support whatever decision Claire eventually made about her marriage, whether that meant staying and rebuilding something healthier or leaving entirely to build something new on her own. Claire began, in the weeks following the gala, quietly exploring options she had set aside years earlier. She reached out to a former colleague from her supply chain management days, someone who now ran a mid-sized logistics consulting firm, and the two of them met for coffee to discuss opportunities that had never previously seemed available to her given how thoroughly her life had become intertwined with Daniel's business. The conversation left her energized in a way she had not felt in years, reminded suddenly of skills and ambitions she had allowed to grow dormant during the long years of supporting someone else's dream instead of building her own. Daniel, sensing the growing distance between them, began making more genuine efforts as the weeks progressed, attending a therapist recommended by one of his colleagues, someone who specialized in helping people examine patterns of insecurity that manifest as controlling or diminishing behavior toward loved ones. He shared some of what he learned in those sessions with Claire hesitantly at first, admitting things about his own childhood that he had never previously discussed with her. Memories of his own father belittling him constantly in front of others. Memories he had buried so deeply he had convinced himself they no longer affected him, even as he unconsciously repeated similar patterns in his own marriage. Claire listened to these revelations with cautious openness, neither dismissing them entirely nor allowing them to serve as an easy excuse for behavior that had caused real harm over many years. She told Daniel plainly that understanding where a pattern came from did not automatically undo the damage it had caused, that healing would require sustained effort over time rather than a single dramatic breakthrough, and that she needed to see consistent change reflected in his actions rather than simply hear it described in his words. Meanwhile, at Ashford Logistics, subtle shifts continued unfolding throughout the organization. Several employees who had previously been reluctant to speak up about uncomfortable interactions with Daniel began finding quiet courage of their own, encouraged indirectly by what they had witnessed at the gala, by the visible proof that speaking honestly, even to someone in a position of power, did not have to end in disaster. Human Resources received several informal complaints in the weeks following the event, nothing that rose to the level of formal action, but enough to prompt Henry Caldwell and the board to require Daniel to complete additional leadership training focused specifically on communication and workplace respect. Daniel resisted this requirement initially, his old pride flaring in private conversations with Claire about feeling unfairly targeted, about believing the board was overreacting to what he still occasionally referred to as simply an unfortunate misunderstanding at a company party. Claire, hearing him minimize the moment in this way, felt the fragile trust they had begun rebuilding waver slightly, and she told him directly that as long as he continued describing that night as a misunderstanding rather than acknowledging it honestly as harm he had caused, she did not believe real change was possible between them, whether in his marriage or in his leadership of the company. Something in her directness seemed to finally break through whatever remaining defenses Daniel had been clinging to. He grew quiet for several days afterward, more withdrawn than she had ever seen him, and when he finally spoke again, his words carried none of his usual polish, none of the practiced charm that had defined so much of how he moved through the world. He told her, haltingly and without any attempt to soften the admission, that he had spent his entire adult life terrified of being seen as small, that he had built the company partly out of genuine ambition, but largely out of a desperate need to prove himself superior to a father who had never once told him he was enough, and that somewhere along the way, he had begun treating Claire the same way his father had once treated him. Diminishing her not because he believed the things he said about her, but because making someone else feel small was the only way he had ever learned to feel secure. Claire absorbed this admission carefully, recognizing in it both genuine vulnerability and the difficult, ongoing work still required to translate insight into lasting change. She told him she appreciated his honesty, that it represented real progress, but she also reminded him gently that insight alone had never been the problem between them, that she had sensed pieces of this truth for years without him ever being willing to say it aloud. What mattered now, she said, was not simply understanding where his behavior came from, but consistently choosing differently going forward, day after day, in ways both large and small, in private moments as much as in public ones. The weeks continued to unfold with this careful, uncertain rhythm, neither fully reconciled nor fully separated, both of them navigating unfamiliar territory that required more patience and honesty than either had previously brought to their marriage. Claire began part-time consulting work with her former colleague's logistics firm, finding unexpected fulfillment in problems that belonged entirely to her own expertise rather than existing solely in service of Daniel's ambitions. Daniel continued his therapy sessions and leadership training, slowly, imperfectly, sometimes stumbling back into old patterns before catching himself and course-correcting. The process far messier and less dramatic than any single moment of public confrontation could capture, but real in a way that mattered far more than appearances ever could. One evening, roughly 6 weeks after the gala, Claire returned home from a long day of consulting work to find Daniel waiting for her in the kitchen, having prepared dinner himself for the first time in years. A small gesture that once might have seemed insignificant but now carried real weight given how consistently he had begun showing up differently in the small, unglamorous moments of daily life, rather than only in grand, performative gestures meant for an audience. He told her over dinner that his therapist had asked him that week to describe what he actually admired about her, separate from what she did for him or provided for the household, and he admitted with visible discomfort that he had struggled at first to answer, not because there was nothing to admire, but because he had spent so many years viewing her primarily through the lens of her usefulness to his own ambitions, rather than as a complete person with her own mind, her own history, her own dreams that existed independently of him. He told her haltingly that he admired her patience, her sharp analytical mind that had quietly caught errors in contracts that could have cost the company significant money, her ability to remain calm during crises that left him scrambling, her quiet loyalty to people she cared about even when it cost her personally. He said he was only now, embarrassingly late, beginning to actually see these qualities clearly rather than simply benefiting from them without acknowledgement. Claire listened carefully, neither dismissing his words nor allowing herself to be fully disarmed by them, aware that genuine change would need to be demonstrated over months and years rather than confirmed in a single dinner conversation, however sincere it seemed in the moment. Grace, during one of their regular conversations, asked Claire directly whether she believed the marriage could truly be saved, and Claire admitted she did not yet know, that she was choosing, for now, to remain open to the possibility while also protecting herself by building an independent foundation that did not depend on Daniel's continued growth. She said she had realized something important during those weeks, that she no longer needed the marriage to survive in order for her own sense of worth to remain intact, and that this realization alone had changed the entire nature of her relationship with Daniel, transforming it from something she needed in order to feel complete into something she was choosing, day by day, because it might genuinely be good for both of them rather than because she feared what her life might look like without it. Margaret, watching this slow transformation unfold from the sidelines, found herself reflecting more deeply on her own long marriage, eventually confiding in Claire that she had begun, for the first time in decades, considering conversations with her own husband about patterns she had long tolerated in silence. She thanked Claire more than once for showing her, entirely without intending to, that it was never too late to expect better treatment, regardless of how many years had already passed in quiet acceptance of less. At the company, the changes proved slower and more uneven than the changes unfolding at home, though noticeable improvements gradually emerged. Daniel began actively soliciting feedback from employees in meetings rather than simply issuing directives, initially awkward and forced, but gradually becoming more genuine as weeks passed. He promoted one of the young women from the marketing department, the same employee who had filmed the toast that night, to a leadership role after recognizing, perhaps for the first time, how consistently her ideas had gone unacknowledged in previous meetings. Peter Lansing noticed these shifts and slowly began extending more trust back toward Daniel, though he continued watching carefully, unwilling to fully relax his guard until the changes proved durable over a longer stretch of time. Henry Caldwell scheduled a follow-up meeting nearly 2 months after the gala, and this time, rather than expressing concern, he acknowledged cautiously that he had noticed genuine shifts in how Daniel carried himself in meetings, how he spoke about the team, how he handled disagreements without the defensive sharpness that had characterized his leadership style previously. Henry told Daniel plainly that trust, once damaged, rebuilds slowly and requires sustained proof rather than a single moment of apparent change. But he acknowledged that Daniel appeared to understand this and seemed committed to the long process ahead rather than searching for shortcuts back to his previous unquestioned authority. Nearly a year passed before Claire felt she could look back on the night of the gala without the sharp edge of humiliation coloring the memory. And when that day finally arrived, she found herself sitting in the small home office she had recently set up, a space entirely her own for the first time in her marriage, filled with books on logistics management and framed photographs from a recent consulting project she had led independently. One that had earned praise from clients who knew her only by her own name and her own expertise, entirely separate from anything connected to Daniel or Ashford Logistics. Her consulting work had grown steadily over the months since the gala, word spreading among former colleagues and new contacts about her careful, thorough approach to solving complicated supply chain problems. And she had recently accepted a larger contract with a regional manufacturing company, work that would require her full attention for several months and would, for the first time in years, provide her with an income entirely independent of her husband's business. The financial independence mattered less to her than the deeper sense of identity it represented, the quiet confirmation that she possessed value entirely her own, unconnected to any role she played in someone else's life. Daniel's transformation, while genuine, had not been without setbacks along the way. There had been difficult weeks, months even, where old patterns resurfaced under stress, moments where his tone sharpened during disagreements or his old instinct toward performance crept back into how he spoke about Claire in front of others. Each time, Claire named these moments directly and without apology, refusing to let them slide back into the familiar silence that had once characterized their marriage. And each time, to his credit, Daniel took the feedback seriously rather than growing defensive, returning to his therapy sessions with renewed commitment rather than treating the setbacks as evidence that change was impossible. At the company's 11th anniversary gathering, a considerably smaller and more modest event than the previous year's extravagant gala, Daniel again stood to offer a toast, though this time the room held a different kind of anticipation. Guests who remembered the previous year's events, watching carefully to see whether real change had actually taken hold, or whether the intervening months had simply been a temporary performance of humility designed to weather the immediate storm. This time, Daniel's words carried a different tone entirely. He spoke briefly about the company's growth over the past year, then turned his attention directly to Claire, seated beside him rather than several chairs away, and he told the room, without any trace of his old performative charm, that he had spent the past year learning things about himself he wished he had understood decades earlier. That he owed the health of his marriage, and much of his own personal growth, to a wife whose patience and honesty had given him a chance to become a better version of himself that he had not necessarily deserved, but was determined to earn going forward. He did not attempt to make the moment about his own redemption story in a way that centered himself once again, but instead used most of his remaining words to specifically credit Claire's role in building the company from its earliest days, naming specific contracts she had saved, specific decisions she had guided, specific nights of unpaid labor that had kept the business afloat during its most fragile early years. The room listened in a silence entirely different from the charged, uncomfortable silence of the previous year. This one warmer, more genuine, guests nodding along with quiet approval rather than exchanging uneasy glances. When Daniel finished speaking, he did not simply raise his glass toward Claire as a symbolic gesture the way he had the year before, but instead handed her the microphone directly, inviting her, without any trace of condescension, to share anything she wished to add. Claire accepted the microphone with far less trepidation than she had felt approaching it the previous year, though a different kind of significance settled over the moment, an awareness of exactly how much distance she had traveled in the months between these two nearly identical scenes. She thanked the room briefly, then spoke not about the past humiliation, which she had no interest in revisiting or dwelling upon publicly, but about the future, about her own growing consulting practice, about the importance of building a life with enough independent foundation that no single relationship, however important, ever again held the power to define her entire sense of worth. She spoke, too, about Margaret, thanking her mother-in-law publicly for the courage she had shown in recent months, courage that had inspired conversations within her own marriage that Margaret had confided, were bringing new honesty to a relationship that had settled into decades of quiet compromise. Margaret, seated near the front, wiped away tears openly this time, no longer needing to hide her emotion behind careful composure the way she had at the previous year's event. Grace, watching from a nearby table, felt an overwhelming sense of pride watching her closest friend stand confidently at a microphone that had once been the site of such painful humiliation, now transformed into a symbol of exactly how far genuine growth could carry two people willing to do difficult, unglamorous work, rather than simply hopping time alone, would heal what specific choices had broken. She thought about how many marriages might never survive a moment like the one from the previous year's gala, how many husbands might have doubled down on defensiveness rather than genuine reflection, how many wives might have chosen, understandably, to walk away entirely rather than risk investing further hope in someone who had hurt them so publicly. She admired Claire's willingness to hold both possibilities simultaneously throughout the past year, remaining open to reconciliation, while never once compromising on the boundaries and self-respect she had finally claimed. Henry Caldwell approached Claire after the speeches concluded, telling her candidly that the past year had taught him something important about evaluating leadership, that character revealed itself most clearly not in moments of success, but in how someone responded to genuine accountability, and that watching Daniel's sustained, sometimes visibly difficult effort to change, had taught him more about the man's true potential as a leader than any business plan or financial projection ever could have. He told her, too, that several other investors had privately commented on the noticeably improved atmosphere throughout the company over the past year, employees appearing more engaged, turnover rates dropping, several talented people who might have otherwise left choosing instead to stay and grow within an organization that finally seemed to be practicing the values it claimed to hold. Peter Lansing, now serving in an expanded leadership role himself, found a quiet moment to thank Claire directly, telling her that her willingness to speak honestly that difficult night had given him and several other employees permission to expect better treatment themselves, that workplace culture had shifted noticeably since then in ways both large and small, fewer dismissive comments in meetings, more genuine credit given where it was due, a general sense that people were being seen and valued, rather than simply used toward someone else's advancement. Later that evening, after most of the guests had departed and only close family remained, Claire and Daniel sat together on the balcony of the venue, looking out over the city lights, and Daniel told her quietly that he did not think he would ever be able to fully repay what she had given him, not simply through her labor and sacrifice in building the company, but through her willingness to hold him accountable, rather than either abandoning him entirely or continuing to accept behavior that diminished them both. He said he understood now that her quiet reply that night had not been an attempt to humiliate him in return, despite how thoroughly it had exposed his own insecurities in front of everyone he had wanted to impress, but rather an act of profound honesty that had ultimately given him a chance he likely did not deserve, but was determined to keep earning for the rest of their life together. Claire told him that she appreciated the acknowledgement, but reminded him gently that the work of change was never truly finished, that growth required daily choices rather than a single dramatic turning point, and that she intended to continue building her own independent path regardless of how their marriage continued to evolve, not out of distrust, but out of a hard-won understanding that her worth had never actually depended on his validation in the first place. A truth she wished she had understood many years earlier, but was grateful to have finally claimed. As the two of them sat quietly together beneath the night sky, the city humming faintly below them, Claire found herself reflecting on the strange, unexpected path that had led her from that painful, humiliating moment at the microphone to this quieter, more hopeful one. And she understood with complete clarity something her father had tried to teach her many years earlier, that dignity spoken calmly carries a weight that anger and volume never could. That the truest strength often reveals itself not in loud confrontation, but in the steady, unwavering choice to value oneself regardless of how others attempt to define that value. The story of that gala continued circulating quietly for months afterward, told and retold among people who had witnessed it directly and among others who had only heard about it secondhand, each retelling emphasizing different details depending on who was speaking, but nearly every version arriving eventually at the same central truth, that a room full of people who had laughed cruelly at one woman's expense had, within minutes, witnessed something far more powerful than the joke that started it all. A demonstration of quiet, unshakable self-respect that no amount of public humiliation had been able to diminish. Claire never sought out that footage herself, never watched the various versions that had spread among employees and eventually beyond the company entirely, content instead to let the moment exist simply as a memory she carried forward, transformed gradually from pain into something closer to quiet pride, evidence not of a marriage's collapse, but of exactly how much genuine transformation becomes possible when someone finally refuses to accept less than they deserve, and chooses instead, with calm and unwavering clarity, to speak their truth exactly once, and let that truth do the rest of the work on its own. In the months that followed the second anniversary gathering, Claire's consulting practice grew steadily enough that she began considering bringing on a small team of her own, reaching out first to two of the younger women from Ashford Logistics, who had confided in her privately about wanting to build careers less dependent on any single company's culture or leadership. She mentored them carefully, sharing lessons she had learned not only from her years of quiet, uncredited work supporting Daniel's business, but from the harder, more recent lessons about recognizing her own worth independent of anyone else's recognition of it. Watching these younger women grow more confident under her guidance gave Claire an unexpected sense of purpose, a feeling that something meaningful had grown out of the painful humiliation she had endured that night, not because the humiliation itself held any value, but because of what she had chosen to build afterward in response to it. Grace often remarked, during their long-standing weekly phone calls, that she had watched Claire transform over that year, and beyond into someone who reminded her powerfully of the confident young woman she had known in university, before marriage and years of quiet self-sacrifice had gradually worn down that early confidence into something smaller and more cautious. Claire agreed, admitting that she sometimes felt as though she were meeting an old, forgotten version of herself again for the first time in years, a version she had assumed was lost permanently beneath the accumulated compromises of her marriage, only to discover that same person had simply been waiting patiently beneath the surface for the right moment to reemerge. Margaret's own marriage underwent a quieter, more gradual transformation during this same period, Conversations with her husband that had once seemed impossible slowly becoming more frequent, more honest, built on a foundation of courage. She credited directly to witnessing her daughter-in-law's example that night at the gala. She told Claire, during one of their regular visits, that it was never too late to expect more from the people closest to you, regardless of how many years had passed in quiet acceptance, and that she intended to spend whatever years remained to her living, according to that hard, one understanding rather than continuing old patterns simply out of habit or fear of disruption. Daniel, for his part, continued the slow, unglamorous work of genuine change, understanding gradually that there would be no single moment where the process concluded, and he could consider himself finished, no finish line beyond which he could relax back into old patterns without consequence. He began mentoring younger employees himself, sharing openly, when appropriate, about his own journey of recognizing and correcting harmful patterns, hoping that his honesty might help others recognize similar tendencies in themselves before those tendencies caused the kind of damage his own behavior had once caused within his marriage and his company alike. 2 years after the gala that had changed everything, Claire stood once again in the same ballroom at the Grandview Hotel. This time for an entirely different occasion, the launch celebration for her own independent consulting firm, now large enough to warrant its own modest gathering of clients, colleagues, and supporters. Daniel attended not as the center of attention this time, but simply as a guest among many, quietly proud, offering support without needing to claim any credit for her success. When someone raised a glass to toast Claire's achievement, she found herself standing once again near a microphone in that same room, though this time surrounded by an entirely different energy, one built on genuine celebration rather than lingering tension. She thought briefly, standing there, of the woman she had been 2 years earlier, sitting quietly at that head table while laughter rippled around her, absorbing humiliation she had convinced herself was simply the ordinary cost of maintaining peace within her marriage. She felt profound gratitude toward that earlier version of herself, not for enduring years of quiet diminishment, but for finally finding, in that single unbearable moment, the clarity and courage to stand up and speak her truth calmly and completely, understanding now that the moment had not merely changed her marriage, but had fundamentally changed how she understood her own worth, a lesson that no amount of comfortable silence could ever have taught her. As she looked out over the small crowd gathered to celebrate her own achievement, built entirely through her own effort and expertise, Claire understood with quiet certainty that whatever happened next in her life, whether her marriage continued to heal and strengthen, or whether some future chapter looked entirely different, she would never again allow herself to disappear quietly into someone else's story. She had learned in the most painful and public way possible that dignity did not require volume, that quiet honesty could dismantle even the most carefully constructed pride, and that the truest victory was never about defeating someone else in front of a crowd, but about finally, fully, becoming herself.